The morning Caleb Whitfield was lowered into the cold October ground, the sky over the high plains of Wyoming was the color of old pewter, and the wind that came down off the Bighorn foothills carried the first true bite of winter. Hannah Whitfield stood at the foot of the grave with her daughter Ruth pressed against the side of her dress. She did not weep. She had spent her tears in the long nights of his fever, and the well had run dry. What stood in her now was something quieter and older than grief. It was the still, watchful waiting of a woman who already knew in her bones that the worst was not yet behind her. Caleb's mother, Cordelia Whitfield, did not look at her once during the burial. Cordelia stood on the other side of the grave in her stiff black mourning dress and her dark leather gloves, her iron gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the kindness out of her face. She had never approved of Hannah. The match, she had said many times in many parlors, had been a mistake. Caleb could have done better. Now Caleb could do nothing at all, and Cordelia's grief had nowhere to go except sideways, into the young woman in the faded indigo dress who had loved her son honestly for 7 years. 3 weeks passed. Hannah went on cooking the meals, mending the linen, brushing Ruth's hair in the mornings. She tried to make herself small inside the big house. She slept in the room she had shared with Caleb and tried not to feel the empty place at her back. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind was up and the fire low, Cordelia called her into the parlor and closed the door behind her. The conversation, when it came, was short. Cordelia did not raise her voice. She rarely did. She told Hannah that the house was Whitfield property and that with Caleb gone there was no Whitfield in Hannah. She told her that arrangements had been made, that the room would be needed, that a good Christian woman would understand. She told her she had until sundown. Hannah asked very quietly about Ruth. Cordelia's gloved hands folded over each other on the dark wood of the parlor table. The child, she said, was Hannah's burden. The Whitfields had no claim on her, and no obligation. The girl, after all, had her mother's eyes. Hannah did not argue. She had lived 7 years inside that house. She had learned slowly what arguing earned a person under that roof. She went upstairs and packed a single carpetbag. Caleb's old leather satchel, scuffed and softened by years on horseback, she put on top of the carpetbag because she could not bear to leave it. She packed Ruth's brown rag doll, a tin of cornmeal from the pantry that no one would miss, a little money she had saved out of egg sales over 3 summers, a small silver locket Caleb had given her on their wedding day, and one folded paper from the back of a desk drawer that Caleb had told her once never to throw away. By the time she stood on the porch with Ruth's small hand in hers and the carpetbag at her feet, the sun was already a thin gold line across the ridges to the west. Cordelia did not come outside to see them off. She watched from the parlor window. Hannah did not look up at that window. She set Caleb's hat on her own head against the wind, took her daughter's hand, and walked down the long, packed dirt road toward a future she could not yet see. Behind her, the door of the only house she had known as a wife clicked shut without a sound. For 3 days they walked. Hannah counted the miles in the strap blisters that opened on her shoulder where the carpetbag rode. Ruth did not complain, which somehow was worse. She held her rag doll under one arm and her mother's hand under the other, and asked, every few hours, in that thin, small voice, whether they were almost there, and Hannah, who did not yet know where there was, said yes, sweetheart, almost. The first night they slept in the lee of a rock, wrapped in Hannah's wool shawl. The second night a homesteader's wife took them in, gave them potato soup and a place by the stove, and asked no questions. The third day the wind turned colder, and by afternoon Ruth's cheeks were too red, and her small body burned against Hannah's hip, and Hannah understood that they could not spend another night in the open. She found an abandoned barn just off the wagon track, its roof half fallen on one side, but its lower hayloft still dry. She built a small fire of broken plank and old straw, boiled snow in a tin cup for Ruth to sip, and sat in the dark with her daughter against her chest and her back against the splintered wall, and tried for the first time since the parlor door had clicked shut, to think. She opened Caleb's leather satchel. She had carried it without truly looking inside. She pulled out a stub of pencil, a tin of pipe tobacco, an old pocket knife, and at the bottom, folded in oilskin, a single legal paper she had never read. By the firelight, she opened it. It was a deed. It was made out in Caleb's name, dated 9 years before he had ever met her. It described 240 acres of land along Sulphur Creek in the foothills, 20 miles west of where she now sat. It bore the territorial seal. It had been signed and registered. Hannah Whitfield, who had not eaten a hot meal in 2 days, sat in the dark of an abandoned barn with her sleeping child against her chest and read that paper 4 times. She had never heard of Sulphur Creek. Cordelia had never mentioned it. Caleb, she realized, had been keeping it for them. It took them another day and a half on foot to reach the place. The track narrowed past the homesteads and dropped down into a long, wide bowl of land sheltered from the worst of the wind by a low ridge of pine. The creek was not hard to find. It ran black and cold over flat stones at the bottom of the valley, and a wagon road half grown with sage and rabbit brush ran beside it. Hannah followed that road around a bend, and when she came around the bend, she stopped in the middle of the track and just looked. The ranch had been abandoned for 12 years. That was what she would learn later. What she saw now was a long, low cabin of dark squared logs with one collapsed corner where the snow of a dozen winters had finally pulled the roof beam down. A barn behind it leaned to the east, its great front door hanging on one strap hinge. A corral with most of its rails rotted into the dirt. A stone wellhead, choked with leaves. And beyond it all, the bones of a smaller cabin half burned and half sunken into the meadow, as if someone had once tried to make a beginning here and the country had refused. Hannah stood there a long time. Ruth, beside her, said only, "Mama, is this our house?" "Yes," Hannah said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Yes, sweetheart, this is our house." She walked the property before the light failed. She found that the main cabin still had 2 of its 3 rooms standing, and a stove, rusted but whole. She found that the well, when she lowered the bucket, brought up clean cold water that smelled faintly of stone. She found in the corner of the barn a coil of good rope, a broken plow blade, and the dry husks of 2 seasons of unburned hay. She found, in a tin box under a loose floorboard inside the cabin, a small pile of yellow letters in a woman's hand, dated 1869, and a child's clay marble. That first night she swept enough of the cabin floor clear to lay her shawl down for Ruth. She nailed a feed sack across the broken window with the back of the pocket knife. She kindled a fire in the rusted stove, and when the smoke drew clean up the chimney instead of filling the room, she sat down on the cold, packed earth floor and put her face in her hands and let herself shake, just for a moment, just for the time it took to gather what she had. When Ruth woke at dawn the next morning, her fever had broken. She sat up in the shawl bed and looked around at the dim log walls and the firelight and the steam rising from the tin cup of melted snow on the stove, and she said, very seriously, "I like our house, Mama." Hannah, who had not slept, smiled at her for the first time in a month. The work of staying alive, that first winter, was the only work Hannah did, and it filled every hour of light. She mended the broken corner of the cabin with planks salvaged from the barn and stones lifted one by one out of the creek bed. She chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and dried grass and her own hands, until those hands cracked and bled and learned to crack and bleed without slowing down. She set traps along the creek for rabbit and beaver. She rationed the cornmeal. She taught Ruth to gather wood inside a careful circle around the cabin, and never to wander beyond the line of stones Hannah laid down. The first stranger she saw was Tom Hayes. He came down the wagon road one cold blue morning in late November, a tall, lean man on a roan horse, with a wide brown felt hat and a long, thin scar that ran from his temple down across his cheek to the line of his jaw. He stopped his horse at her broken gate and did not get down. He looked at her, and at the cabin behind her, and at Ruth peeking from the doorway, and he said only, "Didn't expect to see smoke from this place again, ma'am." Hannah said, "It's my husband's land. He left it to me." Tom Hayes considered that. "Caleb Whitfield's land," he said. He had known the name. Hannah's heart climbed her throat. He did not introduce himself that day. He said, "Need anything?" And when she could not bring herself to say yes, he nodded once and turned the horse around. 2 days later, a sack of flour and a smoked side of pork were left on her porch with no note. A week after that, a second sack and a small bundle of split kindling. The other neighbor, when she came out of the trees on foot. Winona was Shoshone, and old, with a single silver-white braid hanging down over a tan deerskin dress. She did not speak at the door. She set down a basket of dried meat and a hide pouch of pemmican on the porch step and looked at Hannah for a long moment, and then she put one hand to her own chest and said, "Winona." And Hannah, with tears prickling her eyes for reasons she could not name, said, "Hannah." Winona pointed to the smoke from the chimney and nodded once, as if to say, "Good, it is good." By the first deep snow, Hannah had patched 2 windows, mended 1 roof beam, and learned to skin a rabbit in under 3 minutes. Ruth, in a coat Winona had brought made from old trade blanket, helped her mother carry water from the creek every morning. They ate twice a day. They had not been hungry in 4 weeks. The ranch held. When the spring came, it came all at once. The creek rose green, and the willow buds opened, and the meadow filled overnight with crocus and wild iris. Hannah, who had spent the long, dark months of winter sketching plans on the back of old letters by firelight, walked out into that thaw with a list in her head and a kind of hard, quiet joy in her chest that she had thought once she would never feel again. She turned over a kitchen garden in the patch behind the cabin where the old hands had clearly turned one before her. She traded a winter's worth of careful sewing, mended shirts, repaired stockings, 1 good Sunday dress, for 2 laying hens, a sow with 5 piglets, and the loan of a plow horse from a homesteader's wife 2 valleys over. Tom Hayes, who had stopped pretending he was not her neighbor, came one Saturday with a wagon and helped her drag the rotted corral rails out and replace them with new pine. He worked in silence most of the day. He stayed for supper. Ruth, by the end of that supper, was sitting on his knee, showing him the rag doll, and the long, thin scar on his cheek had crinkled twice into something almost like a smile. A traveling preacher, Reverend Halloway, passed through in May and held a small Sunday service in her front yard, and 4 neighboring families came, and afterward they stayed for cornbread and coffee, and Hannah, refilling tin cups in the spring sun, realized with a small shock that she had a community now. She had not asked for one. She had simply stayed and worked and not died, and a community had gathered around her like grass returning to a burnt field. By midsummer, the corral was full. The garden was producing. Hannah had begun to sell eggs into the nearest town, Bitter Springs, 12 miles down the wagon road. She drove herself in the borrowed wagon every Friday with Ruth on the seat beside her and a basket of brown eggs on her lap, and the storekeeper, a kind man named Pell, paid her in cash and goods and sometimes saved the newspaper for her. It was through Pell, on a hot July Friday, that she first heard the name that would nearly take it all back from her again. A man, Pell told her, had been asking around about Sulphur Creek, a land speculator out of Cheyenne. His name was Bessler. He was telling people the deed there was clouded. He was telling people the rightful claim was his. Elias Bessler arrived at her gate in early August in a shining black buggy with brass fittings and a hired man on the seat beside him. He was a heavy-set man in a black frock coat with black hair gone gray at the edges, oiled back from a high forehead, and narrow dark eyes set deep in a face that had practiced every expression but the honest ones. He did not get out of the buggy. He tipped his hat. He said, in the tone of a man who had said it many times before, that he was sorry to disturb her, but the land she occupied had been claimed by his client some years previous, and that any improvements she might have made were, regrettably, his client's improvements now. Hannah stood at the gate with her hand on the latch and her other hand at her side. She did not invite him in. She did not raise her voice. She said, "I have the deed." Bessler smiled the small, thin smile of a man who had been told this before by people he had still managed to remove. He said the matter would be settled in the territorial court in Cheyenne, that the proceedings were already underway, and that as a courtesy he was offering her a fair sum to vacate before the marshal arrived with the paperwork. He named a number. The number was less than the value of one of her hogs. Hannah said, "I have the deed. It is registered. You may speak to the clerk in Bitter Springs." Bessler's smile did not move. He said, "Ma'am, I urge you to reconsider." Hannah did not answer. Bessler tipped his hat again, said something to his hired man, and the buggy rolled away. Hannah watched it go until it was a black speck on the wagon road, and then she went inside and put the kettle on the stove because her hands needed something to do. That night she rode into Bitter Springs and woke the town clerk and asked him, plain, to bring out the registry book. He brought it out grumbling. He turned to the page she pointed at. There, in faded ink dated 9 years before, was Caleb Whitfield's name and the territorial seal and the description of 240 acres along Sulphur Creek. The clerk closed the book and said, "That's clean, ma'am. That's about as clean as it gets." Hannah rode home in the moonlight. She did not yet know that Bessler, by then, had already paid a man to ride out to her ranch with a tin of coal oil and a box of matches. She smelled the smoke before she saw it. 2 miles out from the ranch, riding the borrowed plow horse home through the long blue summer dark, the wind shifted and brought her the sharp, wrong smell of burning pine. She kicked the horse into a run. The fire was at the barn. A small fire still. Whoever had set it badly, in damp hay, and the breeze had turned against him. Tom Hayes was already there. He had seen the glow from his own ridge and ridden over with 2 pails. Winona, who had been sleeping in the back room of Hannah's cabin that night looking after Ruth, had wet down the cabin walls. The 3 of them, with Ruth sitting wide-eyed and silent on the porch step in her nightdress, fought the barn fire to a black smoking ruin and saved everything but the southwest corner. The man who set the fire did not get far. Tom Hayes, in his quiet way, had seen the buggy on the ridge road that afternoon, and Tom Hayes was the kind of man who, once he saw something, did not forget. He found the hired man 2 valleys over the next morning, with the empty coal oil tin still in his saddlebag, and he brought him to the sheriff in Bitter Springs without raising his voice once. Bessler was arrested in his hotel room in Cheyenne 3 days later. The territorial papers carried the story for a week. It was in those same papers, eventually, that Cordelia Whitfield read her former daughter-in-law's name. She read it once, set the paper down, and read it again. And then, after a long, very still afternoon in the parlor, where she had once sent a young widow into the dusk with 1 carpetbag and 1 child, Cordelia Whitfield ordered the buggy harnessed and rode west. She came to the ranch on a clear September morning. Hannah was in the yard splitting kindling. Ruth was on the porch with a cat in her lap. Tom Hayes was up on the ridge mending fence. Cordelia stepped down from the buggy in her stiff black dress and her dark gloves, and she stood at the gate, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Cordelia opened her mouth, and Hannah waited. She did not need an apology. She did not even need an explanation. She simply waited. And Cordelia, faced with the steady hazel green eyes of the young woman she had once decided was no longer worth keeping at her table, found that she could not summon the words she had practiced on the long ride out. "It's a fine place," Cordelia said at last, looking past Hannah at the cabin and the new corral and the smoke from the kitchen chimney and the small girl on the porch. "Yes," Hannah said, "it is." She did not invite Cordelia in. Cordelia did not ask to be invited. After a few minutes, the older woman climbed back into her buggy, turned the horse around, and rode back the way she had come. Hannah watched her go until the buggy was a black speck on the wagon road. Then she went back to splitting kindling. Ruth on the porch stroked the cat. The wind in Wyoming made its long, low, patient sound across the meadow. The ranch held. There is a kind of woman, and there has always been this kind of woman, who is sent down a long road in the dusk with 1 bag and 1 child, and the door of her old life clicking shut behind her, and who does not look back. Most folks, when they see such a young widow walking on such a road in October, will tell themselves it is a sad story, and turn back to their own warm windows. They will tell themselves she will not last the winter. What they do not understand is that the country is not the enemy. The country is the witness. The country was here before the parlor and the gloved hands and the iron gray bun, and the country will be here after them. The country watches a woman walk down its road with her daughter, and the country waits to see what she will do. What Hannah Whitfield did on a forgotten bend of Sulphur Creek in the October of 1881 was put her carpetbag down in the dirt of a ruined yard and say, "This is our house." She said it without raising her voice. She said it because there was no one left to say it to but her own daughter in the wind. She said it, and then she got to work, because the saying of a thing on the high plains of Wyoming is not the doing of it. The doing of it is the morning after, and the morning after that, in the cracked hands and the chinked logs and the rabbit on the trap line and the egg sold to the storekeeper in Bitter Springs. That is how a life gets built out of ruin, not by being told you are welcome at the table. A life gets built out of ruin by a woman who, when the door clicks shut behind her, does not turn back and does not weep and does not stop walking until she finds the place she is meant to stand. Hannah Whitfield found her place at the broken gate of a forgotten ranch. She built her life there with her own 2 hands, and she did not ask permission, and she did not ask forgiveness. The ones who needed to come back came back on their own. The ones who did not, did not. Either way, the ranch held. The smoke went up the chimney clean, and the country, which had been watching all along, kept the witness it had always kept. If a woman is ever told, in some parlor, or some kitchen, or some long cold road, that she is not wanted, let her remember Hannah Whitfield. Let her remember that the door clicking shut behind her may be the most generous thing that ever happened to her. And let her keep walking. The country is watching. The country is waiting. The country always has.